The Justice Department told Texas to stop with the barrier of buoys in the Rio Grande or face legal action. At Governor Abbott's direction, Texas recently set up miles of barriers using razor wire and buoys in the Rio Grande River near Eagle Pass. This comes as an anonymous email sent by a Texas trooper to his superiors and obtained by 3 newspapers have stated that a pregnant woman was caught in razor wire trying to cross the river. Along with that, a girl was drowning and pushed back to the other side of the river. This is among other instances that the trooper has stated has happened while working at the border. For perspective on the situation at the border and how this may play out in court, we talked to Texas immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. She is the owner and CEO of the Lincoln-Goldfinch law firm in Austin.
Well, I'll start with the lawsuit. So the Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit against Texas, and that's pending. We're awaiting, the first hearing. I've reviewed the lawsuit. I've reviewed Greg Abbott's public response in which he cites parts of the Constitution and some case law. I think his argument is extremely flimsy and far-fetched, and he will ultimately not prevail in court. So in my opinion, it's a matter of time. He will be forced to remove these buoys, but how long that takes, remains to be seen. Probably the judge will issue some type of injunction against his activity, and then he may or may not appeal, so we'll just have to sort of allow that to play out. Now, in terms of whether this, matters for border enforcement, I would argue that it does not. The buoys, it's all of the Operation Lone Star activities by Abbott so far have accounted for less than 1% of any of the border apprehensions. And so there's been lots of programs that he's sort of launched and that have failed or not worked. And really, at the end of the day, most of his activities are splashy, and they gain a lot of attention for him personally, but they don't actually have an impact or make a difference. And, that's clear when we see the federal government of the United States going so far as to sue him after they've said repeatedly, your help is not needed, this is actually not helpful, please stop, and he doesn't.
It doesn't help the situation, but it helps him and the Republican Party politically.
No, it's in Greg Abbott's personal best interest to do exactly what he's doing, which is to do something very, egregious enough that people will be talking about it everywhere, and that he will get sued, and that he will get to make these flashy statements. All of this gains him so much political attention and donations, et cetera. And we've seen this over the centuries in the United States. And it's, any anti-immigrant conservative politician knows that their supporters are driven by fear, right? And so when the politician says, oh, it's super dangerous, all of these migrants who are coming across are the drug traffickers, the human smugglers, they are the ones bringing the fentanyl into the country. They're the people who hear those messages and who support Greg Abbott believe him when he says those words. And if you believe those words, then sure, these migrants are awfully scary. But the reality is that these are not the drug smugglers, the human smugglers, the criminals. These migrants are the vulnerable victims of these same criminals, and they're fleeing the danger. If you think about it, drug smugglers and cartels and human traffickers are not the homeless migrants living in tents on the side of the river, just so desperate to cross that they will, take a small child into the river, into the razor wire to get themselves to safety. It doesn't make any sense if you think it through. And yet the Greg Abbott and politicians like him are not counting on people to use critical thinking. They're counting on people to believe their words, get very scared and riled up, and then feel glad that Greg Abbott is doing all of this stuff. And, if I try and get to people, if a humanitarian angle doesn't motivate someone, I think it's helpful to just talk, let's just talk money. Let's just talk fiscally here, because Operation Lone Star has spent $10 billion of Texas taxpayer money. And to put that into perspective, the education budget for the entire state of Texas is $60 billion. So we're talking 1/6 of the overall education budget has been spent on this useless, frankly, border program. And now he's spending even more money defending his actions in federal court in a case, in a lawsuit that he will lose at the end of the day. So it's just money. We're just actually flushing money down the drain, or down the Rio Grande River, I guess you could say.
Aren't the courts backing him? Because, these are Trump appointees for the most part. And if he goes to the Supreme Court, he has an advantage there also. So if he playing a card that he might can win?
I think that that's a good point. And here in Texas, our federal lawsuits get appealed up to the Fifth Circuit, which is notoriously conservative as a court, and then to the Supreme Court. In my opinion, this issue is so clear. It's crystal clear that border enforcement, immigration policy is not a state issue. It's a federal issue. And what Greg Abbott is doing is violating international treaties with Mexico. It's creating, issues within the river in terms of like commerce and flooding and environmental concerns. And all of this is run, it's like we have an Army Corps of Engineers to run studies and figure out when we're going to do something with our waterway, what's the impact of something like that. And so I think it's so clear that even a conservative court couldn't, in good conscience support Greg Abbott's activities, but, we'll see. I don't have a crystal ball, and we will see how it goes. It would shock me if his actions were made it through a lawsuit, though.
And he does that by appealing. So the more appealing he does, the longer he can do what he's doing now.
That's true, although in some cases, these lawsuits can take a while, and that's why we have things like injunctions. And basically an injunction is when a judge says, okay, during the pendency of this trial, you have to stop these activities because they're doing so much damage. And so I would expect to see an injunction on the activities. And now the injunctions can get appealed, but those appeals move more quickly. So, we'll all just have to be paying close attention to the outcome of this. And in the meantime, I hope that not too many lives are lost, in that river. And it's really heartbreaking when you think about it. When you think about someone who is in such a desperate situation that they will face dangers like that with their children in tow, and that we could be heartless enough to install devices that would intentionally harm and drown these people just because they're seeking a better life. It makes your stomach hurt if you really think about it.
Does that include, and I'm just stating what the governor has been saying, and that's, he's saying, and we get into that states' rights versus the federal government. And I think that's what card he's playing, and a lot of other governors and Republican governors are doing, is they're playing states' rights.
I think that, it's one thing under Operation Lone Star for Greg Abbott to send Texas Guardsmen down to the border and to arrest migrants and then charge them with state crimes like kidnapping. And that program came under fire because they were racially profiling and there was due process violations, et cetera. But it's one thing for the state to take actions like that. It's an entirely different thing for the state to, install these devices in the middle of the river in such a way that upsets both the federal government of Mexico and the United States. There's just so many federal concerns with what he's doing in this situation that, it steps beyond a boundary. But again, we have to watch and see, how these arguments play out in court and what the judges do. I will say, I've read the arguments so far that Abbott's office is putting out, and they're claiming that, Article 10, I think it is Clause 3 of the Constitution, gives them, the right to take action. I read the clause differently than they are putting it out there, than they do. Then they cite a couple of cases. One is a case about Senate Bill 1070, which was the Arizona immigration enforcement law that was struck down. 3/4 of the provisions of that law were struck down by the Supreme Court. So overall, the holding of that case is anti-states' rights. And then another case that they mention in Abbott's letter is about whether the federal government can force Texas guardsmen to take the COVID vaccine. And the ruling in that case was that they cannot, that the federal government cannot do that. But obviously, that's not a similar issue. This is not, like when you're assessing case law as a lawyer, it's like, is this fact, scenario close enough to my case and what I'm dealing with that I can apply this ruling or this holding or this dicta? And it really, to me, as a lawyer reading Abbott's arguments, it feels like he's just grasping at straws. And so I imagine it'll be like that when he gets to court, too.
Thank you.